let's talk about some more of your youth activities and some of your playful years. Um, did you have a radio when you were younger?
Nope, there was no radio until, the first radio that we ever listened to was like when we moved from South Dakota to Nebraska. My dad got a radio because he liked to listen to the news and the weather and stuff, and we had a radio. And there was a lot of different kind of stories on these radios that my older sisters would listen to. Romance stories and things like that, But boy, they didn't dare let Dad or Mom catch them listening to them.
Did you go to the movies at all?
Yes, when my older sisters would go to the movie, I could go along with them once in a while, and Dad would give me the money to go to the movie with them. But they had further intentions. They would drop me off at the movie, and they'd go to the dance. And I wasn't supposed to say nothing. Boy, my sisters would never take me along again. So I tried to keep it quiet for them.
What type of movies would you see at the theater?
Gene Autry. Gene Autry was my favorite. He was great back in the 30s, back in the late 30s. Yeah, Gene Autry and, they were mostly all cowboy movies, and back in them days.
Okay. How old were you when you started dating?
Well, it wasn't until I got to Barnesville, Minnesota in my freshman year. I had started my freshman year in Gearing High, but I had to leave my girl behind. So I picked up another one here in Barnesville. And of course, that was before I met my wife.
Okay. How are the customs of courtship different today than they were back then?
Well, I don't know if they're... I don't know what the courtship is today.
Did you have anything such as a chaperone or anything like that?
No. It usually when you when you went out on a date and you had a gal, you usually go to the movie. And very seldom would ever go to a dance because my folks were so against dances. I don't know why, but I didn't know how to dance until I met my wife. She taught me how to dance. And then we wanted to keep going to dances all the time because I loved it. In fact, when our children were all grown up, my wife and I, we went to dances every Sunday. They had old-time music at the Galaxy Supper Club in Barnesville, and we'd go there every Sunday night.
Who attended these dances? Was it younger people or mainly older people?
It was mixed, yes. There was a lot of younger people. And a lot of times there would be wedding dances too, and then there'd be all kinds of ages, little ones on the dance floor and out having a great time.
Do you remember your parents' attitudes towards sex at all?
Oh, they were deadly set against. That was supposed to be reserved until you were married. That's the upbringing.
Did they ever talk to you about it very much? Any advice or any...
Yes, advice a lot of times, you betcha. My dad would shake his fingers and he'd tell me, behave yourself. When I'd go out on a Saturday night or Sunday evening, behave yourself. I knew what he meant.
All right. If we could switch now over to your farm life, that type of thing. Since you have lived in several places growing up, could you describe your farms in South Dakota, Nebraska, and Minnesota?
Well, I didn't do much. The only thing that I was accustomed to in South Dakota when we lived there, I was too young yet then, because I was only 11 years old when we moved away from there, and it was mainly chores, like helping my mother milk cows and help take care of the livestock. I'd done a lot of feeding and helped them with that. But then when we moved from there to Gearing, Nebraska, then I was running equipment on the farm. First of all, horses. The thing that stands out in my mind is one time he put me to work with 4 big Belgian horses ahead of a drag and sent me out to a field to do some dragging. And I remember that it was a 5-section drag and it was 4 horses ahead of it. And then there was a big wide plank that was across the back of the drag, and then you stood on there. And then you hung onto the reins. You had 4 reins that you had to handle. You got to the end, you turn around, you pull the reins on this side, and of course the horses were gentle and everything. But this one day, I was down about in the middle of the field, I remember, and there was a jackrabbit that had, you know how they'll kind of bury down into the ground a little bit, and he jumped up on the side that was the spookiest horse, and he took a leap and he started galloping and spooked the rest of them, and I had to run away. And of course, I had the reins wrapped around the back here because I got tired of holding them, you know, and just put them around here. And then, well, through all the process of them galloping and jumping and stuff, I fell off the drag and got out from under those reins and stuff. And by the time I got on my feet and I got to running to try to catch him, I couldn't begin to catch him. The neighbor was feeding lambs across the road, and I remember there was a drainage ditch between us, and he seen what was going on, and he dropped everything he was doing. He was feeding, he had a fattening pen there, he was feeding lambs, and I noticed him jumping over a fence, and by that time, he was down trying to cross that drainage ditch, but the horses had run into a woven wire fence. That stopped them. But they were tangled up. Drags behind them, woven wire fence ahead of them, and they were all cut up from it, trying to get out of that woven wire. And of course, there was 2 strands of barbed wire across the top. And he got there, and he got him quieted down, and he got him untangled from the mess that they were in, and then I remember he led the horses to the barn. And when my dad got home and he heard that I had to run away with him, and I got a licking because he figured I wasn't paying any attention to my job. And I tried to explain to him. But it's a good thing the neighbor was there, and he said, "Hey, Jake, I seen this. That wasn't his fault. I seen this rabbit jump up at him that spooked them horses, and he couldn't begin to hold him." That ended it there. Yeah, he was ready. He was ready to whop me one.
Generally, how close were towns for you um, to your farmsteads? How close was town?
Well, usually between 5 and 8 miles on the average. I think we were like, when we lived in South Dakota, we were about 4 miles from Batesland. And we were about 6 miles from Wounded Knee, if you know where that's at. Well, there's where we went when the government had it out that you had to get smallpox shots. That's where we went to get our smallpox shots, is Wounded Knee in South Dakota. But usually between 4 and 8 miles, I would say.
Living so close to the reservation there, did your parents ever warn you about going close to the reservation, or what were their views on Native Americans?
No, in fact, we had Indians coming into the yard every so often. I mean, they would bring firewood, they would bring poles, and fence posts and stuff like that, because they were living on the reservation where the trees were, and they had access to the wood, and they would bring a load of firewood for just a meal a lot of times. And then I can remember a lot of times my mom would say, "Here comes those blamed Indians again, just in time for a meal." And Dad says, "Why, look at the wood they're bringing." And then she'd get ready to prepare for them too, and always just before a meal, so she'd have to put on more food. And they were hungry. They were just as bad off as everybody else was back in those Depression years.
Since you were living so close to a Native American reservation, did your parents have any views on Native Americans, or did you have any interactions with Native Americans?
Well, they were. My folks were trading with them all the time. They got along good with them. They had no problem with them. I mean, to us, they were just like any other people. I mean, we grew up with them, and we didn't see it any different than anyone else,
You mentioned that you did some trading with them. What type of trading did you do?
Well, they were on government land on the Indian reservation, and we lived, I think it was only about 3 miles from the reservation. That was government land, and that's where the Indians were living on. And the government at that time would let them rent out for grazing land. And my dad always had grazing land because he had a big herd of cattle, and I remember I hated it when school was out because I'd have to go with the hired man to, I'd be gone for weeks at a time from home. And there was a little cabin, and I remember a log cabin that we stayed in. And he made the hired man made the dinners all the time. I got so sick of his biscuits to this day, I can't eat biscuits. Anyway, it was a log cabin that we lived in, that we stayed in, and we'd always wait till the herd was ready to settle down and bed down, and then we'd go into the cabin, tie our horses up. We always had a little hay that we'd feed them, and either that or we'd peg them out so they could eat grass while we were in the cabin. I remember it was just boards nailed together with a straw for a mattress. And one time I felt something moving around when I crawled into bed, and here it was a rattlesnake. Had gotten in, it was just a dirt floor, had gotten in and was trying to find a warm place. I got up and to this day, I don't know how I could have found it without getting bitten, I just pushed the straw away, and first I pushed the blanket away, and then I seen it moving. I thought it was a mouse or something, Here was a rattlesnake sticking his head up. No, I could have slept all night with that thing. It probably wouldn't have bothered me, but boy, it really scared me. And boy, after that happened, I just hated to be there. I was glad when school started.
How did you finally get the snake out?
The hired man, he got it. I forget now how he did it. He had, I think he just shoot it out of the cabin with the stick, but he always carried a shotgun on his saddle in case that we encountered some rough Indians or something, or somebody that was trying to take some cattle away. You always had that problem, back in those days. Somebody stealing somebody's cattle. And anyway, it was, he got it out of the cabin. I don't know whether he clubbed it to death or whether he pulled his shotgun. I can't remember. But that scared me. And they were a lot of them. There was a lot of rattlesnakes. I remember one time we were out herding, and I was sitting on the horse I think it was with my sister at one time. And the horses they seem to know when they hear that rattling noise. They shy away from it. They go way around it. I was glad I was on the horse then. Yeah, there was a lot of different experiences with Indians. Some good, some bad. There was a neighbor that wanted that same grazing land that Dad had rented from those Indians, from that Indian, for many years, and he wanted it the worst way. It was good grazing land, and he wanted it. So he got this Indian drunk, and I remember this was on a Sunday morning. Dad was in getting ready for church, and we had a baptism at church that morning, and he drove in. He was drunk. And Dad sent I remember the guy that was the hired man, he went out. He was getting ready for church too. And he went out to see what he wanted, and he didn't want nothing with him. He wanted to talk with Mr. Jerger. So Dad had to come out, and he talked just like a drunk would talk, from one thing to the next. And first it was religion, because he had mentioned that, hey, what do you want here on Sunday morning? I'm getting ready to go to church. And, he said, if you're not interested in what I've got to tell you, he said, I've got another thing. So he reached in it was a Model T Ford, and he had a revolver. I was standing beside my dad when this was happening. He had a revolver, he pulled that out, and he says, here, he says, I'll show you. And the minute he held that gun at my dad, he had it out of his hand just that quick. Because he seen he was drunk and he figured he could outmaneuver him, and he did. And right then and there, he figured he knew who put him up to it. Because he just hated the thought that my dad had that grazing land all those years and he couldn't get it. So he got the Indian drunk and he sent him down on a Sunday morning to shoot my dad. That was an episode I'll never forget. Because I was, I'd say probably 6, 7 years old. I was standing right beside him, and it was happening. Because I wanted to see what that Indian wanted, You know, when you're a kid, you want to know what's going on. And, yeah, that was one episode I didn't like. And another one was, one time I remember my dad had an old International truck, and I must have been about 7, maybe 8 years old. And he had to go to Gordon, Nebraska, if you know where that's at. And he had a load of, I think it was about in 1935, because that's the only time I can remember he ever had any wheat. He had, I remember it was a single-wheel truck, and it had wooden spoke wheels, that I can remember. And it had, I'd say, a box on there maybe would hold maybe 80 bushel or something like that. That was a big box for a truck with the single wheels. And I had to go with him because he'd done a trading with a Jew that had a store there, a clothing store. That's where he'd done his trading in Gordon. Whenever he would bring produce there, he would. Well, here he had a bunch of eggs. We had in the truck a case of eggs and I think a cream can of cream. And we got within about 8 miles of Gordon, Nebraska, and back tire blew. So, and there wasn't many cars going by, but there was a lot of Indians going to Gordon. But they never used the road. They always used the bar pit. Whenever they'd get to a approach and they're off of the road, they'd go up over the approach and they'd follow the bar pit all the way in. Never on the road. I don't know whether it was because they were afraid of getting hit, because it was all hours of the day and all hours of the night. They'd be coming and going. But this happened to be in the daytime, and my dad says, well, you're going to have to stay here and watch this cream so it don't get stolen, and these eggs. And I cried, and I cried, and I couldn't. Well, I can't help it, he said. You've got to stay here, and it's going to be gone. And I said, well, what can I do? Well, he said, they won't bother you as long as they say that somebody is here. Otherwise, they'll steal it. They will steal it if there's nobody here. So I remember they were going by. Some of them never paid no attention, but this one stopped. And I thought, uh-oh. I was crouched down. I didn't want him to see me. He jumped up on the running board and he looked in. And he seen I was there. Turned around, went back, got on his buckboard, and he went on. Boy, was I relieved. I was glad when I seen Dad come back, because I seen him go over the hill, and I thought, when will I ever see him again? But a little while later, here comes a guy that had a tire, and he had put it on for him, and had a jack and everything. And so we went on in, and I remember we went over to the cream station first and got rid of the eggs and the cream. And he went over there to get his load of wheat unloaded. He got a check for that, and then he went over to the cream station and got his cream check and egg check. He was going to pay for the tire, so he went over to the tire store and was going to pay for his tire. And I distinctly remember he gave him the wheat check, and he had to dip in his pocket and pull out some more cash. I don't remember or recall how much to help pay for the tire. He only got 14 cents a bushel for wheat. It was more than what that load of wheat and he had to, I don't recall how much he had, but I know he had the cash for the cream and the eggs. And he had to reach in his pocket for the rest of it.
Okay. You mentioned that he leased land from that Native American. Did he own or rent the rest of his land? Or is it rented, or did he own it?
You mean the native?
No, your father.
No, he owned the farmland we owned, but the grazing land we rented from the Indians. The government land that the Indians were on.
Okay. How many buildings were on your parents' farm?
You mean in South Dakota?
Yeah.
Well, it was just that tar paper shack that we lived in, and then he had a garage. I remember it was a garage that he kept his car in, and then there was a kind of a lean-to on one side that had a tool shed where he kept his tools in, and then on one end of that tool shed was a little room where the hired man stayed. And then a granary, I think it was, on the place. And later on, I think it was like in 1935, he put up a straw shed. They had a bunch of poles up, and then they strung netting, and then they thrashed straw on top of it. And the cattle would go in there in the wintertime, to get out of the shelter, out of the winter cold and stuff, to be in shelter.
What about in Minnesota? What type of buildings were around your farms in Minnesota?
Well, I remember we had that two-story house, and we had a granary, and we had a nice big granary, but it was old. And we had a barn that was built just a year before we moved on, and it was a hip roof barn. And it was fairly new. It was only a year old when we moved there in the spring of 1940. And it had stanchions in it, and enough that we could milk 25 milk cows. So that was the one first beginning of a real dairy, really, compared to what we were used to. And it was all handwork, I remember milking. We had that chore before going to school in the morning, milk the cows, separate the milk, because we didn't have bulk tanks or anything like that then, it was the cream. You'd take the cream to town.
Okay. Throughout your different farms and all the different places, were they mainly grain farms or dairy farms, or they kind of diversified?
Well, it seemed like he was always diversified. He always had cattle, always had milk cows, chickens, hogs. I think that's what made him self-sufficient. They didn't have to depend on the government for anything, except when they couldn't raise any crops back in the drought years of the dirty 30s.
What types of, you said you had cows, chickens, and pigs. Were those Were there any other types of animals that you had on your farms?
Sometimes sheep, yes. I remember shearing wool, and he'd take the wool off in the spring of the year. And that was a kind of a cash crop for him.
Did your family ever butcher these animals, such as when you got ready to make them into sausage and other things?
Always butchered them on the farm. Cut up their own meat on the kitchen table. With the old hand saw, I can see him yet doing like this. First he'd split them out when they're still hanging, you know. Split them with the saw, cut them in halves. Then they'd leave them hanging until they cooled, you know. That's why I think that's the reason that they butchered in the, like late fall, late November, just before Thanksgiving and the holidays. And because they didn't have to worry about flies, they didn't have to worry about spoilage, meat spoiling, and because we didn't have refrigerators or coolers or anything like that.
Did you remember your neighbors? Were they very close?
Well, there were sometimes they were, yes. We had neighbors within a mile and a half from us a lot of times. Especially when we moved to Nebraska, they were closer, a lot closer, because they were small farms like 160, 240 acre farms that were all under irrigation and sugar beet farming. There's a lot of sugar beets that were grown back in those years in the 30s.
Was there a lot of interaction between the neighbors? Between you and your neighbors?
In what way?
Did you visit very often, or did they help out with work?
Oh yes. Neighbors help neighbors. You betcha. When it come to work, I mean, you could depend on a neighbor for help.
Were there any big work activities such as brandings or harvest time where a lot of neighbors came together to help?
Yes, I remember distinctly branding time in South Dakota. You had to have a brand. And I mean, if you had cattle that you were putting on government land, grazing land, you had to have a brand on them because there was a lot of stealing going on, and then a lot of times cattle would roam and get into somebody else's pasture and somebody else's land, and if it didn't have a brand on it, you didn't know whose cattle it was, but the brand would tell the story. So I remember yet the brand that my father had was called, it was, the state of South Dakota has a record of the brands that they had. It was called Lazy 77. That was one, my dad was JJ. It was Jacob Jerger. And it was one J standing up and one J laying down.
What method did you use to brand your cattle?
Branding iron. I've still got the branding iron.
Okay.
I've got it, yes. I can prove that it's a Lazy 77.
And how are the calves tied? How are they held down? Did you?
You had to rope them. They were wild. I mean, their little calves were wild. And it seemed like they always do it every spring before you turn them out in pasture or before you put them out on grazing land, so that you had some kind of an identification. And it was always in the spring before grass time is when branding time was, and neighbors would get together and we'd get calves branded.
What were some of your jobs during branding season?
To help hold a calf down. Oh, I used to hate that. Yeah, that was a job, I tell you. It was. Well, what I hated the most was when that little calf would beller, and you knew it was hurting him. And that was hard. It was hard to take. And you see this skin burning and smoke coming up, and yeah, it was hard to see.
Okay. What were the ethnic groups in your community in South Dakota, Nebraska, and Minnesota?
Well, most ethnic groups in South Dakota were, I would say, those that we were in contact with were mostly German Russian, because we were in a community there. It seemed like they trailed one another or something. I remember they had one part of the old town in Scotts Bluff they called Russian Town. And there was one in Gearing too. And usually where these Germans migrated to, they all hung together. It was like a clan, you know. And that's where there was a church go up. And that's the church that they would go to, you know. I remember the one in Gearing that we went to was a Lutheran church. And all around it, they called it Russian Town. The Americans at that time called them Russians. They didn't know they were German.
Did you ever have any difference of opinion, or do you ever have any trouble with the difference between country kids and town kids? Was there any rivalry or anything like that?
No, not that I know of. I never got into any of it anyway.
All right. Let's turn to the chores that you had to do on the farm. Could you tell us a little bit about the chores that you had to do as a child?
Well, when I was younger, I mean, I had to, just like I was telling you before, that I had to do a lot of following my mother when she done the milking chores, helping her getting the cattle so they would come. She'd call them, and then they would come, and then I'd put out a little pile of grain for them, and then we'd milk them right in the corral without even tie down or anything. I can recall that was in South Dakota, and then when we got to Minnesota, of course, it was different. Then it was in my high school years then, but then we had a nice barn that we could milk them in and stuff. And then we had to separate them and separate the cream from the milk, and we always had a bunch of calves and pigs that we fed the skim milk to. But it wasn't until later, you know, later on in my youth there where I was doing field work and tractor work and running horses. When we moved to Minnesota, we had a thrashing run. My dad had half interest in a thrashing machine. And we had a thrashing run. We had 8 bundle teams. And this was in 1942. I must have been about 17 or 18 years old. 17, I think. I had a bundle team. I had a team. And Had to keep up my end with the rest of the guys. Age 18, had to pitch on my bundles, bring them into the threshing machine, and pitch them off. That was hard work. The hottest days of summer is when you would be threshing grain. And I remember I had the biggest hay rack in the bunch. Biggest hay rack in. My dad had a hay rack, I think it must have been at least 20 feet long, and I was supposed to fill that thing up and try to be in on time. You kind of keep your turn, you know. Well, there's no way I can fill that rack up and be in there on time. And I told Dad that, and he said, well, he says, I'll have to put a spike pitcher out in the field so they can help you. So he put my cousin, she was a lady, big, strong German-Russian lady, and she could pitch bundles as long as any man could. And boy, that was a help. Yeah, that was right on the farm out here by Barnesville, where we run a threshing rig for 1940, 41, 42, 3 years. Then we went to combining, 1943. Done away with all that hard work.
Did you help other neighbors thresh as well?
Oh yes, yeah. You'd thresh one neighbor out, and they'd take turns from year to year. You know, well, you were first last year, you'll be last next year. So I don't know how they did it, but they would take turns doing it. You know, and yeah, we would thresh on neighbors' places too.
Was there ever any big meals after the threshing was done? Any kind of community meals?
No, we had big meals every day. We had 3 meals. I mean, we had breakfast, we had lunch, then we had dinner, and we had lunch again. Of course, we had supper at home then. But I mean, there was always plenty of food to eat. They never had no big deal after it was all done. I think everybody was so darn glad to get done with it, and they're all so tired of it that they didn't want any part of the cooking anymore, the women especially.
How would your family do laundry when you were growing up?
I remember with one of them washboard and a tub. I can remember the first washing machine my mother got. She thought it was a godsend, and it was. From all the hard work of slaving away at a washboard with homemade soap. It was slavery.
How often did she wash clothes when she still did them by hand?
Once a week on Mondays. Monday morning was wash day.
And did you or your sisters or your brothers have to help out with that?
Oh yes, you betcha. Sunday night I had those that were old enough to carry the water in, so it'd be ready on the stove so Mom could heat it up in the morning, and the firewood. That'd all have to be in place. Yeah, I've done a lot of that.
Where would you hang the clothes to dry?
An outside wash line, winter like summer. You can laugh, but it's the truth. That I can remember bringing clothes in from outside in the wintertime, and it would be like this, and you couldn't even get in the doorway. It would be froze solid, you know. Bring it in, and then you'd have another wash line strung inside where you could finish drying it, you know.
You said your mother made her own soap. How did she do this?
Well, they used the fat that hangs inside of a critter, you know, that you don't use. I don't know what you call it. They would save that when they butchered. And shortly after the butchering and the sausage making, everything was done, then they would make the soap out of this lard that hangs in around the stomach and the intestines, and they'd pull all that lard off, and that's what they would use. And they would use, I remember, lye, and that type of lard, they would run it through one of these little, well, the same thing that would grind the meat up. They'd run that through and set on the stove and render it. And then they would add the lye to it. And as far as I know, it's the only thing I know that was added to it. Then when it got hard, then they would cut it in little squares. But with the lye in it, boy, that was really a cleaner. I mean, it really cleaned the clothes good. But it kind of had a lye smell to it all the time, which I didn't like.
I understand that you have a story that you would like to tell when you moved to Minnesota.
Yeah, I had to go with a hired man and in the boxcar. That's how I moved to Minnesota. My dad put all his belongings in the boxcar. He had his machinery in one end. I think we had about 7 head of livestock we had on one end, and they had made a kind of a corral there to keep the livestock in one spot, in one area, and then we had to put a feeder in the hay and I had to go with hired man, and I was actually a stowaway. There wasn't supposed to be nobody but one going with the car. And Dad says, whenever the train comes to a stop, he said, you make a dive and then get under that hay feeder. He said, otherwise they're liable to put you off of that train. I thought, oh my goodness. And boy, I was faithful to that, because when you're 16 years old and you know you're not supposed to be on there unless you've got credentials, why, I was afraid, you know. Of course, whenever a brakeman would come around and it'd come to a stop, and he'd ask, whatever, you got business on this boxcar? Yeah, I got credentials here. I'm going with the cattle. Okay. Anybody else? Nope. So we left Geary, Nebraska. I remember it was 60 degrees. It was short sleeve weather. Last week in February. And we got loaded up and everything, and the train pulled out of Geary, and it was just about, the sun was almost setting. We got to Omaha, Nebraska, and they had hot boxes on the wheels under the boxcar. So they side railed us, and we were side railed for 7 hours. Every time a hired man would watch one of the officers, a brakeman mostly, coming down along the side of the train to check on who's in there or what, and then he'd say, hurry up and hide, there's a brakeman coming. I'd make a dash over the corral under the hay feeder. And I remembered I was laying there for a good hour one time, and that brakeman was just standing there chatting with him. with the hired man. And it was cold. When we got to eastern Nebraska, the weather had changed to 40 degrees. It was about 40 degrees then. And finally, after that episode, we took off again, and the further we come, the colder it got. And when we got to St. Cloud, we was on the Great Northern, we got to St. Cloud, we had hot boxes on the wheels again. When they get a hot box, the brakeman is always constantly checking, and then they sidetrack you, and they got to put different bearings in, different wheels under. So we were sidetracked there for another 4.5 hours, and of course that wasn't so bad, but it was cold. And I remember the hired man asking my brakeman, "How darn cold is it here?" this was St. Cloud. And he said, "Well, where are we?" Well, he said, "You're in Minnesota." Oh, you're in St. Cloud. Okay. Well, how cold is it? And he said, "Oh, it's 20 below here." And then we were approaching the last days of February then, because we were on the road for 7 days from Gearing before we got to Barnesville. And we finally got to going again from St. Cloud, and we never stopped anymore then, but it seemed like, oh my goodness, it is getting colder all the time. And we had a feather tick that we were sleeping on. We had a cot that we slept on, but it was right in the middle, and there's doors banging on this side and doors banging over here. You know, these doors that in the middle of the boxcars. And that's where the cold was coming in. And we thought we was going to freeze to death before we got to Barnesville. And we had a feather tick over us, one under us, and we had all our clothes on, just like you were walking outside, and we were cold. We were froze up. And the only warm thing I had was the warm milk that we were milking from the cow. And what we didn't drink, we had dogs on there, we had cats on there, we had chickens and ducks, whatever we didn't drink, why, they got it. That was the only warm thing we had for 7 days. Cold sandwiches. And we got to Barnesville, I remember. It was on a Sunday morning. And it was bitter cold. North wind blowing like mad, and it was cold. And we pulled up to a sidetrack, and we had to walk down to the depot agent, and we wanted to find a place where we could get a warm meal. Oh yeah, he said that we've got a cafe here in Barnesville that stays open 24 hours a day to accommodate the train people, and the hotels too that accommodate the train people, like brakemen that have to lay over, and stuff. And as my hired man and I walked around the corner of that depot agent, I remember it was 26 below zero. I said, "Johnny, look at here." And he said, "Oh my goodness, what did your dad ever want up here in this godforsaken cold country?" I said, "I don't know." But what enticed him to come up here was, and how he got to Minnesota was, there was a fella by the name of Raleigh Whitnack that was in the real estate business in Gearing, and there was a lot of these German people that couldn't find any cheap land anymore. The land was selling for already then in Nebraska, in that Scottsbluff area. It was selling for $250 an acre, And that was expensive land. And when he heard that you could buy land up here that you could raise sugar beets on for $35, for all the way from $20 to $35 an acre, he enticed a lot of these German people to come up here. And they seen what kind of land that this was and how flat it was. Oh, they were enticed. They loved it. Now he brought a whole carload of these German people up here, and my dad was one of the first ones. And this Raleigh had a brother by the name of John that was in the real estate business up here, and he's the one that got them out here on the different areas where the land was for sale. And there was a lot of land that was for sale at that cheap price because it was after the coming out of the Depression, and a lot of it was land that the government, the state got from taxes and not paying taxes. The state owned lands, a lot of it was, and that it was up for sale. The state wanted to get rid of it. And my dad, this John took him to this farm that we're on now. That was the farm that my dad bought in 1940. Well, then we got to that cafe, and boy, we had a nice warm meal, and it was grand, boy. It was nice. And then we wondered how in the world we were going to get out to the farm. My dad, well, I said, Johnny, my dad told me that I was supposed to look up a certain person, and I had his name. I had his name wrote down and everything, and he says, you look him up and he'll bring you out, because I met him and he said he'll do that. Okay. So after we had our meal, we asked the waitress whether she knew this fella. Yeah, he tends the spud houses down here. He keeps fires going to keep the spuds from freezing. You know, in severe cold weather, they've got these little kerosene burners that they set up all over in the spud houses to keep the potatoes from freezing. Normally, if it's not severe, the weather isn't too cold, they don't do it. But he was tending to these, filling them and making sure that they keep going. And the guy's name was Max Peppel. He was an old German. And we went down there, and he's kind of half blind. Dad said, you got to kind of, I got to tell you this, he can't see very well. And all the time I thought, well, gee whiz, if he can't see very well, how in the world is he going to drive us out there? Well, we got down to the spud house, and he was sitting there smoking a pipe. He had the fires all tended, and he was come walking in, and I remember he was squinting his eyes. And I remember Dad was saying that eyesight was bad. And I told him, I said, I'm Jake Jerger's son, and he told me to look you up, and then you would bring me out to the farm. He says, yeah, but he said, we'll have to wait a minute. He says, my wife and my daughter are in church right now. He says, my daughter does the driving. I can't drive anymore. Boy, I was relieved then. And then when they come out of church, why, he called, and his daughter come down and took us out to the farm. That was an episode I'll never forget. Coming on that boxcar. And you know, years later, I must have been at least 55 years, I think. Just recently, I think about 8-9 years ago, somebody drove into the yard, and there was 3 or 4 people in a car, and I said to my wife, I said, well, I wonder who that is. I've never seen that car before. She said, I don't know. And my sons were out in the yard doing something, and I remember an old gray-haired, whiskered man got out, and he walked over to one of my sons and said, does Emmanuel Jerger still live here? Yeah. He said, who are you? He said, I'm one of the boys. I'm one of his sons. he says, "Is your dad here?" And he says, "Yeah, I'll take you to the house. He's in the house." I was sitting and reading papers right after dinner, and he walked in and he said, "Well, hello there." I looked at him, looked up from behind the papers and looked at him, and I thought, who in the world is that? He said, "Well, don't you remember me? I'm your old boxcar buddy." I said, "My gosh," I couldn't believe it. He was he was only 22 years old, of course, at that time, and I was a lot younger. I was only about 16. And then I never seen him for 55 years. Here he lived in Fortuna, California. And he had been in, he left, after he left for the service, he went into the Seabees, and he was in that until the war was over with. And then he went, I don't know where he met this gal, but he settled in California, and he always wanted to look me up, he said. He had a sister in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis. And she said that he always mentioned he wanted to see me. So one time he come down from California to visit her, and she said, "Well, this time I'm going to take you there to see him." Okay. And that's when he walked in on me that day. But I didn't recognize him. He had a rough life. He turned out to be an alcoholic, and he was tough shape. They had to dry him out several times. He finally got off of the booze, but I couldn't believe it was him. Goes to show what booze will do.
How long did you stay in Minnesota then before your dad and the rest of your family came up?
Well, he loaded he had a truck and a car, and he loaded the furniture in the truck. And he had another hired man and his wife and my two older sisters that would take turns driving the truck. And my dad brought the car with the family, and they followed each other. And it only took them 2 days to get here, and they just couldn't figure out where in the world we were at. Well, we had no communication. They didn't know where we were at, didn't know what happened. They couldn't figure out why we should have been on the road for 7 days. Yeah, it was 7 days we were on the road, and it was all because of the problems that they had with the wheels. I don't know whether the car was overloaded or what the deal was, but they had machinery stacked to the very top of it, and he had his tractors and his drill and his farming equipment and all the chickens and ducks and geese that they had, and 7 head of cattle. That's how I come to Minnesota, and I'm still here.
What was it like growing up on the plains for you?
Plains, you mean like in...
Like in Nebraska and South Dakota and to some extent Minnesota? Just the flatness?
Well, I was only 4 years old when I left Colorado. I didn't remember too much of it, but I remember a lot of Nebraska before we moved to South Dakota, and I liked Nebraska. I didn't care much about South Dakota. I think it was mainly because of the hardship.
Did you like or dislike the flatness and the remoteness of the plains? How did that affect you?
Well, the high plains you're talking about?
Yeah.
Well, there's not much flatness in western Nebraska or Colorado. That's the high plains. Well, I went back there many years later. I mean, in fact, the first time I ever seen it was after I got married to my wife, and we went on a honeymoon. And we went because I had a lot of relatives there, and we went back there to visit relatives, and oh, I loved it. I mean, I just thought, what in the world did they ever leave this for? Well, I found out later they lost their farm when banks all went under in the crash of '29. That's when they were farming there in Colorado, and they just, interest rates are high. In fact, I've got some checks that I saved over the years when they lived in Colorado and even in Wyoming. They lived there 1 year, but they only stood at Wyoming for 1 year. They said the wind blew every day and twice on Sundays. Wind, every day, nothing but wind. That was they lived at Fort Laramie, north of Fort Laramie, if you know where Rock River is. They had a farm there 1 year. They got out of there in a hurry. Went back to Colorado, and then from there to Nebraska. I think it was 1920. No, it was 27. But I think the reason they lost their farm was the high interest rates was in the making already then. And farming, without a banker, it was impossible back in them days. Nobody had the money. The banker had it. But interest rates then, I've got checks to prove it, they were 11 and 12%. That was a lot then. Especially when you're getting only 14, 15 cents a bushel for wheat. You no wonder that there's so many of them lost their farms when they couldn't grow crops because of drought. And I remember in South Dakota in the winter of 1936, the last winter we lived there, Dad almost lost his whole herd from the cattle starved to death because of the fact that they couldn't put up enough feed. The only feed that was growing that summer was Russian thistles. I remember putting up Russian thistles in the road ditches to try to get enough feed for the cattle to survive. That's how bad it was. Then the government would ship in hay a lot of times by rail, and then you had to go way to Gordon to get it. And that was 40-some miles, It was hard to get. It was impossible almost in the wintertime. Then the government came out with a thing that your oldest cattle and your skinniest cattle that weren't going to survive the winter, they was going to pay you, I don't know, $10, $12, or $15 a head or wherever it was. But you had to drive them to a place, they had a hole dug out. I remember going with the hired man, driving what Dad had picked out of the cattle that he knew wouldn't survive. He took them down. We drove them down to a place, I don't know, must have been 2 miles maybe, 2.5, something like that. They had a hole dug out, government officials there. They had guys there with their guns. You drove them up to as close as you could to the hole, and they had a caterpillar there with a dozer on it. They shot him, put him in the hole and covered him up. It was nothing but a rack of bones. I mean, it wasn't fit for nothing else. But the government at least helped, so that people could survive. Yeah, it was a dreary part of our history. The dirty 30s. And not too many of them lived it. I mean, not too many of them that are, well, I say that there's a lot of them that lived it, but there's a lot of them that aren't here today that can talk about it.
You were a little farther north most of the major dust storms, but were you ever hit by any dust storms in the Dirty 30s?
Well, most of them, the bad ones were like in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, and the wheat growing areas of Nebraska. But yes, we had dust, but it was periodic. It wasn't a constant thing. But what was bad there was the heat was so intense. We'd have enough moisture in the soil to get crops started in the spring. But then we'd get these hot winds from the southwest. And inside of a week, less than a week, a lot of times, the crop that was up, winter wheat was up about like that, would be like if you went out there with a torch. And it was just brown. There's nothing you could do but turn the cattle out and salvage what there was of it, and then put up hay in the road ditches and in the green areas, and I remember putting up hay on the reservation, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation up by Kyle. I think that's still on the map yet. A big cowboy town. They had a documentary, I don't know who put it on, but on Channel 13 it was from that. And I said to my wife, I'll be doggone. I remember when I was herding cattle, Kyle, South Dakota. I said when I was herding cattle, and up over the hill I could see the water tower of Kyle. That's how close I was herding cattle on that Indian reservation. I was on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation.
Did you ever have any problems with grasshoppers or jackrabbits or other pests during the 30s?
No, I think it was too dry for the jackrabbits to survive, but the grasshoppers, they survived. I got to tell you a story on grasshoppers. The pastures were getting brown, and my dad says, well, we're going to have to fence in this lower area, this kind of a canyon there was that was wasn't pastured, it normally was farmed, but they weren't farming it anymore for some reason or another, I can't recall. But anyway, it was a lower area, and there was the grass was green, because we had enough snow in the winter, and in the low areas, a lot of snow lays in there, and it stayed green longer. So me and the hired man was put to work to fence that up. And I think, if I recall, it took about 2 days, a little over. I was helping him. He would dig the holes, and I'd set the posts and tamp them in. And we were getting the posts from the Indians, and they were oak fence posts that were split. And the split side was straight, and that's where you stapled your wires to, your barbed wire. And the other side was on the outside, and it had the bark on it yet. Well, the first day we got those posts set. The next day we went there, we was going to string wire. And well, when we left there, the posts were full of grasshoppers. And those grasshoppers, they moved around on that post. In the afternoon, they were on that side, on the opposite side of where the sun was. And when we came there, those grasshoppers were so thick on them fence posts, and every fence post was stripped of bark. That's no lie. I've seen this with my own eyes. I couldn't believe it. And I told Dad, he come there and he brought his cattle in there, and he said, did those Indians bring them fence posts here stripped like that? I said, no. Grasshoppers did it. Oh my gosh, couldn't believe it. And they would come in swarms. It was just like a cloud coming. And wherever they landed, boy, that was it. That was it. That was it. It was, that was terrible. And the heat was so intense, too. And they talk about global warming. We had it then already. And now we got too cold. It won't warm up in Minnesota.
You mentioned earlier the government helping out by taking cattle that were not going to make it and paying ranchers for them. Do you remember any other government help agencies such as the WPA or the CCC?
That kind of came into the picture after we left South Dakota. I remember that was 1933 when Roosevelt got in. All these troubled times that we had was through the Hoover administration, because it seemed like he didn't care about common ordinary people, or I don't know what the deal was, but he never done anything about it. Well, the farmers and the ordinary working class people got sick and tired of it. We had a Republican administration for a number of years, and I remember Hoover as being the last one there, and then Franklin Delano Roosevelt got in 1933, and he was in for 3 terms. It goes to show you what he did for this country. And that's kind of the reason I'm a Democrat today. Not for the reason that a lot of people think, but for what he had done for this country. He's the one that got all these things going, get people back to work again. I remember my dad was getting a German paper, and it was published in Yankton, South Dakota. That was when we lived in South Dakota. And it was about German Russians abroad and about the German Russian living in this country, in America. And it was called the Dakota Free Press. In German, it was Dakota Freie Press. And he was, I think it was a monthly paper. But I remember seeing a picture in there of people standing 2 miles in Chicago in a bread line. No work. People were starving. Yeah, that was back in the 30s. There was no work. People wasn't working. Yeah, there was tough times.
Is there anything you'd like to add about the Dirty 30s that we haven't gone over? Any other stories?
Well, it's just that I like to recall too much of it. There's times are too tough. You try to forget them.
All right. Could you please tell us how the outbreak of World War II changed your life?
Well, I was just in junior in high school, and of course the way my dad talked about wars, and he said we've always left. He says our ancestors left Germany because of wars, and we're sick of wars, and that's why we left Russia. And now we're facing wars again. He didn't like wars. Well, I don't think anybody that has to fight wars likes them, but he said, now this is different. We were attacked. But to fight wars just to take over another country, he didn't. He's seen too much of that in his growing up. But he said, this is a war that has to be fought. I lost a lot of my best buddies in school. One of my best buddies was killed in. Battle of the Bulge in Germany. Yeah, and another one that got killed in France in another drive that they had there. And he enlisted, and he wanted me to enlist. I said, no, I'll go when I have to, but I'm not going to enlist. And he went in, and he went in May, and we got word that he was killed in October. Yeah, just think, from the time he goes in until he got killed, it was only 6 months. That's just how fast they needed men. And he was right in the thickest of it all. Right there where they were pushing and trying to push these Germans out of France. Yeah, that is kind of one reason that I never enlisted. I said, Eugene, I'm not going to enlist. No way. He begged me, wanted me. He wanted me to go in with him. He had a twin brother. He never enlisted. But when he got called, he went, and but he lived. He lived through it. He didn't see all this action over there. He got in kind of on the tail end of everything when the cleanup was going on, and he's been dead now too. He's a twin brother of Eugene, and he died of Alzheimer's. He's not here anymore either. So that's thing about this World War II. You try to forget it, but it had to be done. Yeah. Just like you see a lot of these old people now that are on, that were in World War II on this documentary that they have on Channel 13, you know, you hear some of their stories, and gosh, it's horrifying. And I don't know if you've seen it here the other night. They had it on Channel 13 on this the biggest ship that ever was, that floated the seas. The Japanese had in World War II. Did you see that? Mamamoto, I think was the name of the ship. They didn't think it was sinkable. It was twice as wide as all the other ships that were on the seas. And it had the biggest guns. And it had, they could shoot off their cannons and hit another ship 27 miles away. That's how they advanced they were with their ship. But the Americans, with their warplanes, outmaneuvered the big ship. That was when the Japs decided, hey, we got to do away with the ships, we got to get the warplanes. They seen what we were doing. And that's how they attacked all those little islands along there. They started out by Japan, and they kept going till they got to Pearl Harbor, and they sank our whole fleet. And that's what put us into the war. We weren't prepared for war. We didn't believe that. Nobody believed it. Here we had Hitler on the eastern shore and the Japanese on the western shore, and them two dictators were in cahoots, and we couldn't believe it. We had to gear up for war, and that was all at once. I can remember that. I remember the day Pearl Harbor was attacked. I was in high school. It was on a Monday morning. We didn't have classes all day. We were sitting and listening to the monitor in school on the radio broadcasts that was going on. It was horrifying. And that's when a lot of my high school buddies, shortly after that, enlisted. It was a must. Of course, there was a lot of them already in the service, but in various parts of the country of the world. You know that I know there's a lot of like this hired man that I was telling you about. He went into the Seabees. Well, that was already going. You know, the war was already going in different parts of the world, and they didn't think that would happen here. That would ever happen here. But they found out years later that Hitler was real close. He was right close to New York in the Atlantic Ocean with his submarines. I'm sure you recall that. Yeah, and the Japanese on the other end.
You mentioned earlier about rationing. How did rationing affect your family during the war?
Oh, it was kind of tough. I mean, you had to improvise. You had to make sure that it was going to last, and make sure that. Well, we had gas rationing, and we had tires that were rationed, and we had. I know sugar was rationed, coffee was rationed. You just when you put a little sugar in your coffee, you didn't put as much in, and things like that. You know, you had to try to make it last. It was different. You just couldn't go in and buy it. You had to have you got your. I forget now what they called these.
Voucher?
Yeah, you had to have it. You got it from the government, and it all depended on how many in the family. You know, that's how they doled it out to you. The bigger the family, the more you could get. Yeah, there was a lot of things. I forget now. There was other things that were rationed too, but I can't remember all of it.
You mentioned that your church in Minnesota had just stopped speaking German because of the war. Did speaking German affect your relationship with other people or towns or anything else besides your church, or did you limit your German?
Well, when the war was going on, we limited the German to just at home.
Let's continue with your childhood memories. What was your most stressful childhood experience?
Well, I would say the most stressful is seeing my brothers with muscular dystrophy.
What is your happiest childhood memory?
When we moved away from South Dakota. I was so happy when we moved away from there. No more cattle herding.
Is that the main reason, was the cattle herding?
Oh yeah, I hated it. Can you imagine only 10, 11 years old and have to be there in the wilderness? You say it was wilderness. All you seen was Indians, you know, and seeing Indians back in the 30s compared to today, you can't even hardly tell that they're Indian today. They're so mixed up already. They had long hair clean down to below their belts. And boy, they look they look wicked. And then they'd have their powwows in Gordon, Nebraska. I remember just one time I think Dad took us there. I think he wanted to see it. And they go to Gordon, and it's a week-long event. It's Indian powwow and a rodeo. Well, I don't know if he went to see the powwow or whether he went to see the rodeo. I think it was a rodeo he wanted to see. He's seen enough Indians. But we did get to see it. but that's the only memory that I really liked about South Dakota.
Okay. You might have already told us this story, but what was the most adventurous thing you did in your childhood?
That was an adventure when I had that going in that boxcar as a 16-year-old. But then, I started thinking, I thought, well, gee whiz, now here my dad was 16 years old and he come across that Atlantic Ocean. That was a bigger adventure than what I did. So you take it with a grain of salt. You think, hey, this is nothing compared to what the adventure that he took, and coming to a land and not being able to speak it and not even knowing where they're going. He tells the story that when, he told me the story many times, when they got to New York, they wouldn't let him off the ship. They couldn't figure out why. And here they found out that the only ones that could get off at the ship that didn't have any money that they could go any further, and the ones that were sick and couldn't go beyond. So they had these small ships, small boats or whatever you call them, coming to the big ship that they were on, and were taking these people off and going back and forth, and they were docked there for quite some time. And he never could figure that out. Why? And then finally, all these years we didn't know why that happened. And what they had to do was, they stayed on that ship. They couldn't get off there in New York where they wanted to dock, and wanted to get off. They had to sail around Florida, come up to Galveston, Texas, to their port of entry then. And he never could figure that out. He said it took just as long to go this way as it did to come across the Atlantic. And then when they come into Galveston, when was that terrible flood that Galveston had? I think it was just a year before, 1912. Was it 1911?
I'm not certain, but I know it was early in the.
Well, he was telling me how devastating that was when they got off there at Galveston. He said it was a hurricane that had just went through there and almost demolished the whole town. It was previous. I know it was previous, a year or two or whatever, maybe even longer. I'm not sure, but I know it was before. Well, then from there they went to Deerfield, Kansas. My dad had an older sister, and they sponsored them, and that's where they started out their life here in this country. And I think maybe that's the reason that when my dad went out with his folks, I was telling you previous here in the discussion that when he went out with his folks and they come back in again, he didn't want to go that same route again, so they looked for different routes, and they chose the one coming in through Canada. And another reason, they found out it was cheaper too. It would have been because it didn't have all that sailing to do, that. One of my boys, Kenny, was living in New York at the time, and we wanted to see Ellis Island, and that was in, I don't know, this must have been about 10 years ago or something like that. And I tossed a question to the gal that was showing us around there. I told her this story. Why? Why did it have to go around? Well, that's when I found out what I was just telling you, that it was just the sick and the ones that didn't have any money to go any further. Can you imagine leaving a country and going to another country? You don't know how much money you're going to have. It takes a lot of guts. Yeah.
Are there any other stories or memories that you'd like to share with us from your childhood?
Haven't you heard enough of them?
Just have a couple more questions here. Why do you think it is important to tell your life story?
Why is it important? I think that's part of history. That's why we have history. To know what happened. We'll look back. And for our children and grandchildren to know. I tell some of these stories and my grandkids don't even want to believe me. They don't think it's possible. There's some of these stories that I've told you. It's just not, they can't imagine it, you know. But it's the truth. You lived it. It's history. That's why we have it.
Are there any other thoughts or observations that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I don't know. It seemed like every country that was abroad wanted to come to America. Now, I don't know. If things are going to go the way they are going, they're going to be going back to the old world again. It's not good in our country the way it is today. With our youth, what is wrong? We all know what's wrong. There's families where there's only one. There's not a father figure in a family. I don't know what percentage it is, but it's too many. Too many children are being brought up without a father. And a mother has to work, and she can't be there every day to watch her child. When she comes home, who's he with? Probably some hoodlum and teach him a lot of things that he shouldn't know and shouldn't do. It's the breakdown of our society. Divorces. I never heard of a divorce when I was growing up. What have we got today? Single family homes, school children coming in with guns and killing each other. It's not good. Our society is going to have to change. We're going to have to do something different than what we've been doing. And you know, one breakdown is, I mentioned family. Child being brought up by a mother without a father, or vice versa. Teachers can't teach a child anymore. You can't lay a hand on them. You can't even tap their fingers anymore. You can't. You know, that's all in the upbringing of a child. It tells you that right in the Bible. You shouldn't spare the rod when you see a child that's going the wrong way. You can tell him in a decent way. But you know what? What happened was, to my estimation, was too many people were abusing their children in the wrong ways. There's a way of bringing up a child and a way of abusing them. You got to bring up a child so that they have respect for you too. You know, after they're gone, after they've grown up. The only thing about it is, I don't know what it is, but I think that's part of it. And then we're living with too many things, too many material things. We're all trying to outdo one another with money, with cars. I grew up without toys, but I had a good life. I enjoyed my youth outside of South Dakota. We know we had to work and everything like that. We had responsibilities. And a child today that's growing up, 9 times out of 10, they don't have enough responsibility. And the parent isn't willing to carry it out, the discipline, for fear that the authorities might come and put him in Hoosgow or in the jail. That is the thing that bothers me the most about our country, is the youth growing up today. And it seems like so many of our young kids today, they're gun crazy. And a lot of these laws have to be changed. These gun laws that they have today, the only ones that can get guns without a prescription or without any government interference is the criminals and the youth that don't need the guns and shouldn't have them. We would solve this school problem with them coming in and shooting and killing a bunch of innocent people. And something has to be changed, and it all begins in the home. It all begins in the home. It's hard to say, it's hard and it's sad to see all the material things that our youth have today. I don't know whether you want this on your agenda or you want to hear this or not, but I mean, it's the truth. It's the thing that I live with every day with my grandchildren, great-grandchildren now. Of the material things that they have, and they're never satisfied. And you can get by with less, and you can be just as happy. But you gotta be with the Joneses. And that's another thing that's bad for our society. Too many want to acquire too much material things. There's other things that makes you happy without material things. A good home life, and between a man and a wife. What's the matter with our laws? Why are these gays getting advantage of our country? I don't think it's good.
Well, I would like to thank you very much for sharing all of your wonderful stories with us this afternoon. And I'd like to thank you just for sharing everything with us.
Well, thank you.